Away we go then. So today we're going to talk about configuring the firewall and kind of the initial settings, um, what it'll take to get logged into it. Most of this is going to go pretty quickly today, and then we'll have a lab on Thursday. Again, the plan will be to log in here with the lab, we'll record it, do all that kind of stuff, so you at least know how to do the first one as you go through it. So click on this over here. Go. All right. So initially gaining access to one of these Palo Altos, if you guys are working with a physical device or even a VM side, you guys will work with the dedicated out-of-band management interface, or you have the option of using a serial console port like that one over here, right? So works pretty smooth on this side. That management port will default to 192.168.1.1 on a /24. However, if you're using the VM series firewall, it would be a DHCP client. And then it'll have the default administrator account of admin. In the labs, you guys will actually use a different username and password. We'll talk about that when it comes up. But by default, you'd have admin. These are the different web interfaces or the access tools that you guys will have in order to interact with the Palo Alto. For the most part, everybody in this class is just going to be focused on this web interface. All right. If we had Panorama over here, this one would allow you guys to play a little bit with multiple of those. It's extremely expensive, so not many people get to play with that unless they're managing a lot of firewalls in between. You also have the SSH or the console CLI in there in the lower left. Most of you guys coming from the Cisco world, this is what you would expect to be playing with. However, that's not as prevalently used on the Palo Alto side. In the early days, there was actually way more available in the web interface than there ever was in the console. The console has now gotten commands in order for you to go in and play with it. It's nice if you're going to do some scripting or something like that in order to be able to SSH in and run some scripts. However, a lot of that is much better done with the REST XML API. And you guys, has everybody taken Python or at least advanced Python in here? Just not advanced Python, right? You've taken intro, just not advanced yet? Okay. So in the advanced Python, you guys will know a little bit more about these type of API packages and stuff like that. With the intro side, you guys will at least understand the concepts. We will do a little bit in that in this class. It's not actually in the labs, but I'll show you what it would look like. And you guys can actually do quite a bit in that fresh or in that interface. Initially getting logged in, you go out to the IP address. The main thing you guys will have to remember is everything is HTTPS. A lot of students will pull up a website, go to 192.168.1.1, that's what it said, and did HTTP and not HTTPS. All right. It does not redirect you. It just flat out says page cannot be found. So it doesn't mean the firewall is not up and running. It is. You got to do HTTPS. So that's like the first thing everybody fails in the first lab, and they're trying to figure out why it's not working. All right. When you get the username and password, they got the standard complexity stuff, 8 characters, 1 upper, 1 lower, and 1 Roman numeral special character. Those requirements cannot be changed, and they are not applied to other administrator accounts. So once you get logged in, you'll also see the password change down there in the lower left. From the CLI, this is the primary use that you guys would ever use this for, is to do a factory reset. So say you inherited a Palo Alto and you guys want to reset it and make it brand new. You could do that. You would do a request system private data reset. That will erase all the logs, all the settings, including IP addressing, which is the cause of any lost connectivity. Saves a default configuration after the management IP address is changed. And then during boot up, if you have an unknown username or a password for the admin account, you can also go from the console port, type in maint during boot up, and tell it to reset to the factory default. And that will load a previous configuration file with the admin password is changed or invalid. All right. Anybody have any questions on that part? There is a nice, cool pop quiz at the end of this. Doesn't count for points, but it's pop quiz nonetheless. All right. In the web interface, again, this is primarily what you guys will be playing with. As a layout at the upper left, This will be your main functional category tab. So as you guys get the lab information and it says click on device, then click on this, then click on this, it's always going to start with that upper left side. All right. So when it's telling you instructions on what to do, you start with the stuff up there in the upper left. Most of what you'll use in this class are at least relevant. You'll pretty much touch them all. But the monitor tab is where you guys are going to be looking through logs and files, making sure your traffic's doing what it's supposed to be doing, security stuff. Your policies is where all of your security policies will be, as well as your NAT policies. Anything else in addition, if you're using the advanced features, the main things are going to be security policies and NAT policies. Objects is where you guys are going to be translating things like IP addresses to names, so you can keep an address book. If you guys are dealing with PCs and you want to translate names to IP addresses or names to admin accounts, things like that. That's where all that kind of stuff is stored. In the network side of things, this is where you would set up your network interfaces, your zones, things like that. And then device is anything dealing with the firewall itself. So for example, licensing, et cetera, which we'll cover in a minute. That's where you would go in and adjust that. In the lower left-hand corner is your logout button. Upper right-hand corner is your commit button. This is where you will commit changes. So you can make all the changes in the world you want in the firewall. Nothing takes place until you commit, which is completely different than what most of your Cisco stuff you guys have been playing with so far, right? When you're on a Cisco command line, you type in a command, boom, it's done and it starts working. That can be good and that can be bad, right? You know, if you do an erase start and hit enter, bad things, right? Anybody ever done that before? Really mad at themselves? Yeah, it's not fun. In this side of it, you have to commit your changes before it actually takes effect. The help portal is up there in the upper right. And then down in this lower right, this is beneficial for tasks. If you guys are committing something to the firewall or it's running something else that you guys committed, you can always come down here, click on the task button and make sure it's actually doing its job. A lot of people where they get stuck is not knowing these basic places in the web UI. All right. When you're editing things in the UI, you're going to see something like this over here in the upper left, where you have these red underlined things. This means that that particular tab has required thing in that needs to be filled out. All right. So if you're trying to hit over here and trying to hit OK and it's not showing up, you're more than likely missing something off one of the tabs. If it has a red underline, that's what you're missing. If it has a red box over here, that's the field that's required that needs to be coming up. And if you need help up there, you can always click the question mark and that'll explain what the name field is and description and all these other ones going down. All right. If everything's in there, the OK button will show up. Again, it sounds silly, but this is where people are like, I can't click OK. Why didn't you fill out the one with the red line on it? All right. Okay. So initial configuration, again, this first lab you guys are doing, nothing set up. There's no internet access. There's no nothing. You took it out of the box. You set up an IP address. By default, has the 192.168.1.1. You guys are logging into that. That 1.1 is the inside interface. You guys are going to be setting up the management interface, which is that out-of-band management, to be 192.168.1.254. All right. At the top there, and again, this where it says device setup interfaces management, you come back to this interface here, it starts with device in the upper right. Then you would click on system on the left, then you would go on and click the other ones as you go across. So it always starts at that top and works its way across the screen. Okay. For a management interface, again, you can set a static or a DHCP. Which one has DHCPs by default? VMs, right? You can set up your static with the IP address, your net mask, and your gateway at a minimum. You can do IPv6 if need be. These administrative management services is what you can enable for whether or not you want the system to respond. So by default, it will respond off HTTPS and SSH. You guys will more than likely turn off SSH if you're never going to use it. You do not really want to use HTTP and Telnet. Does anybody know why? Exactly. They're all clear text, right? So you type in username and passwords, I can literally see it as it transmits across the wire. Okay. For network services down below, this is what you're going to allow on that administrative interface. Typically, we like ping turned on so that we can ping it and make sure it's up. You guys are used to that. Just because it doesn't respond doesn't mean something's not there. It more than likely has ping turned off, right? For example, on the WAN interface, when we set things up, and that's the outside interface, we typically do not allow ping on the WAN side. Does anybody know why we wouldn't want to allow ping on the WAN?
The hackers can constantly ping against the server and do it like a DOS type of attack,
Yep, exactly.
denial
You
of
can get a
access
ping
type
of
of.
death out there. So what they'll do is they'll just sit there and ping your interface. That's how, one, they know what's up. Yes, you can know what's up, but they also know what's up and responding. And they can also change the MTU sizes and everything else of those ping packets. Normally, ping packets are pretty tiny, right? That doesn't mean that we can't crank up the packet size with some kind of Python scripting or using whatever else under the hood, and we can start sending massive ping packets. Remember what happens when you receive a ping packet? What happens? Yeah, it has to send one back, right? If we send a bunch of ping packets really, really fast to a server, it has to process those ping packets by design. Therefore, you're going to end up creating a denial of service because you can overload the system. Yes, if one device is sitting there pinging it, not so much. But if I use a distributed botnet to start all pinging at once back to my server, I can end up taking down the firewall and doing that. Now, normally that wouldn't happen on the management interface because this is out of band and you should not be getting that. But that's the reason we wouldn't want to enable those kind of services on our public interface, right? You also probably don't want to add a SSH or HTTPS. That should not be on the WAN side, right? If you need to hit that firewall, take advantage of things like VPNs to get you on the inside, then hit the firewall from there. If you open it up to the world, it's a bad day because most hackers are just sitting there pinging it. Even if you don't have anything there, I get people flooding my firewalls on these Palos day in, day out. Like I just got a phone call this morning because of the amount of traffic we were getting to one of the systems in there. It's getting flooded from all over the world. Primarily Russia and North Korea and a bunch of other places are just randomly pinging that system. It's not a huge deal until we start responding and doing that kind of stuff. But they're actually accessing. It's doing one thing is it's filling up our logs. That was my issue. Was all of a sudden the server was getting overwhelmed with logs, all because the firewall was filling up. All right. There's a couple ways you can prevent that, and that we'll talk about that as it comes through. But right now, that's kind of the issue we're in. Sorry, somebody had a question over here. Forgive me. Yep, DDoS. Thanks, Aaron. Sorry about that. I didn't have that up where I could see it. Okay. The other thing that you can do, and you should take advantage of, is that permitted IP addresses over there on the right. That will allow us to say, hey, only this IP address range can access this management interface. You should lock that down to whatever network that you're coming off there, right? So I should not be able to hit that 192.168.1 dot something from a 209 address. Even if somehow I can magically route to there, I should not allow anything that's not in that subnet. Preferably, you wouldn't actually allow an entire /16 subnet. That's a little crazy. You should probably limit that down to one or two addresses if you're coming from a management console. If you're running one, for example, here at Fort Hays, I wouldn't limit it to the Fort Hays subnet. I would limit it down to just the people that are managing the network, their IP addresses in there. I shouldn't have to walk up to this PC in a classroom to log into the firewall for the university. Probably not the best idea. That should be coming from their laptop or their desktop that they have when they're actually managing it, right? The more of these restrictions you put in place, it can be a little bit of an overhead, but trust me, it will save you a lot of headache and issues of other people trying to access the system.
Hey, I got a question here,
Yeah.
Jason. So rather than using the CIDR with the IP range, can we use the individual IP address, like a specific IP
Yes.
address?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you can either give it a CIDR block or you can give it an individual IP address. Yep. And so when you do an individual IP address, you would use a /32, right? Because that's just one IP when you do a /32.
Good to know. Yep.
So I would say something like 192.168.1.5/32. Okay. Good question. Anybody else? Move on. Cool. So other initial configuration stuff, we'll typically go in, set a host name and a domain. By default, that's just set to the firewall model name. So your guys's will be set to VM50 or whatever else by default. You can also accept the DHCP side, which are a bunch of options, and that's only if configured by the management side. The big thing for us is whether or not you want to set a login banner. You guys might have remembered this from the Cisco classes you took, where you could set a login banner. We can do something similar on our side. We can also determine what TLS mode we want. We can force the admins to actually acknowledge that login banner, particularly if we have something like making sure you are only from a secure system accessing this. And if you click yes, you are accepting that you are, right? So if you're not, people can come back and hit you. Even if you're the admin, then you have a policy in place in order to pull that up. And a lot of times you'll have more than one admin to a Palo Alto, right? And we'll talk about that when we get into users. But a lot of times you'll have more than one. However, only one person usually commits at a time, right? You can talk about this TLS or SSL TLS profile. We'll get to that in more detail when we get in there. Setting your time zone, your locale, the date, the time, and more importantly, this latitude, longitude. This is pretty handy. If you actually set where this thing is physically located, then when you actually pull up a map and see IP addresses coming from other places, it will actually translate those to other countries. You can pull up a map and see everybody that's hitting you or where this is physically located. So it makes some of the mapping inside the system a whole lot easier if you set that. Down below, you can see things like automatically acquire commit lock. We won't actually play with those. Using a hypervisor assigned MAC address. So if it is a VM, you can use that mark. Tunnel acceleration, advanced routing I played with, but it's nothing that we would have to do in here. All right. Once you get that up, then you probably want to turn on some DNS services and NTP services. That's one of the most common things I see when I get out in industry is a lot of people don't set up their NTP services, right? And it would be best if you have one device on the network that has NTP that's pulling from the outside source. That should be the firewall or whatever is closest to the outside edge, all right? Unless you have something inside that's hosting it. So if the firewall pulls from poolntp.org, then everything inside your network should point back to the firewall for NTP services. That way, everything on the network has the exact same timestamp. It doesn't sound all that important until you start correlating information from servers, from network switches, etc. when you guys are under attack. If everything's off because they're not pointing to the same NTP server, you're going to have some bad issues on the outside. All right. You also don't want to go point everything inside your network out to these public ones because you want something to always pull from the same on the inside. That way, everything's coming from there with next to no latency if it's running onside the network. Okay. A lot of that will be when you guys get to the 322 course cyber operations. We talk about a SIME and being able to correlate all this information coming from switches, devices, servers, antivirus, all these other services that you guys are running on the network, all comes back to one system. And this allows us to make those logs actually match everything all the way around. So most people forget to set up NTP. It's a pretty big one on the network. Outside of that, we have the DNS servers up above. So you'll want the update server and then the DNS servers. This allows us to go get our updates for the firewall itself. Right. Service routes. So by default, the management port is used to access the external services, which means if your management port does not have internet access because it's on a sandbox secluded network, that you will actually have to swing the service route off of the management port to whatever your outside WAN port that you determine is on your firewall, right? And what that does is allow the firewall to go get updates for the firewall, allow it to go pull anything that's in the management services. So DNS servers, NTP servers, anything it's trying to pull, it's going to do it over the management port by default, right? So again, the negative to that is if you have internet access on the management port, then it can go get its services, but now you allow outside connections or there's a way to get back to it. Most people sandbox their management out of band stuff. So all you have to do is swing those service routes over to whatever Ethernet port you determine is your WAN port. Okay. So here's an example of how to set that. You would set your service route. For example, all these different services over here, what port they would actually be using to get out. All right. So when you first get a firewall, you'll have to register with Palo Alto support. You'll activate your licenses within the device. If it's a hardware firewall, you'll retrieve those license keys from a file server. If it is a VM-based firewall, you'll actually get an authorization code, and you'll dump that code in, which will then authorize that for whatever services you got. All right. You'll verify your DNS connections, and that'll allow you to get to your management content updates. And then lastly, you can verify what operating system that you want to have up and running. The only way to figure out what the current running recommended version is to have your Palo Alto support account. All right. It's not publicly posted what you have access to. You actually have to have your support account on their forums in order to go see what the support says the best version is running. Most people do not run the latest and greatest OS, right? So I think they're at 11.1 something right now. Most people are still running 10 or even 11.1 and multiple revisions back. Most people don't stick with the major revisions every time, mostly because of the updates or the infrastructure. There's usually big changes in the apps, and we'll talk about that when we get in there. That can cause a lot of problems in some of the newer versions as well. Also, the higher up that you go in the OS, the more load it typically puts on the system because you got all these new fancy features. So if you're running Palo Alto 11 on one of those old 220s that I was talking about, you can figure about 15 minutes on a commit when you make changes to that thing. It just takes forever. Okay. Anybody got any questions on activation? So to activate, you'll go to your device and licenses down here in the lower left. You guys can see where you can retrieve keys or activate using a code. And then you can see all the services you're paying for. So when you buy a firewall, you don't just buy the firewall, you actually have to buy all the support packages with it. So for example, Palo Alto 820 was probably $1,400, somewhere in that ballpark for the hardware. You're probably going to pay $1,000 to $2,000 for the software, for the subscription. And you got to do that every single year, right? Or you buy a 5-year license or whatever you end up buying through there. So it gets pretty costly to run the Palo Alto stuff. The hardware is one thing, but the support contract is really what kills it. However, you're getting a lot for what you're paying for, right? And you don't have to buy every single one of these packages. You may only want certain packages to go through here. For example, if you guys aren't using their VPN service, you want to use your own, you don't need to pay for the Global Protect portal. If you don't care about having the latest and greatest antivirus threat prevention and stuff like that, you don't have to turn on Wildfire. We'll talk about all those services throughout the semester. On software updates, and you guys will get to play with that a little bit when we do ours, you can download about 2 to 3 versions on the system itself, and then you can validate those and then actually install them on the system. All right. There's obviously a finite amount of storage on one of these firewalls, so you can't just download every OS that's available, but you typically have to do step allowance, which really changed in 11. You can actually do major jumps now within a certain version, but before, say I was down here on like 10.2.3, if I wanted to move up here to like 11.0 whatever, I would actually have to do to this one and then be able to jump up to the next one. So you got a stair step between all these different OSs. That got a little bit better in the newer ones. If I remember right, you can jump one major revision or something like that in between them. Otherwise, you can literally spend a whole day upgrading these things if you need to do a massive jump, because it's got to download it, install that version, check it, verify it. Then you move up to the next increment, download it, install it, check it, verify it. It takes forever on a slow system. On the dynamic updates, these are scheduled to usually be checked at certain intervals. By default, you're going to see something like this one up here, where it checks every hour at 43 minutes past the hour. That one's checking for the antivirus profile. And then by default, you can either set to have that download or download and install. So this one will automatically download and install the latest updates. And then you can actually revert that back. It's really nice to click on the release notes directly within the system. This allows you to go see what changes were made. Where that's really important is down here in the applications. And so you'll notice in the applications and threats file that one is set to download only at every hour past the 52 minutes at the hour. Notice these are not at the top of the hour or anything else. They stagger them as they go through. That way you're not constantly downloading stuff all the time. All right. On the app ones, a lot of times you'll want to review the apps or review the policies. This will make sure that you're not cratering something that you already set up in your system. So a good example is when I look at Microsoft as an app, right? I can do, say, OneDrive, for example, or I can do the entire Office 365 suite. So I can allow the full Office 365, or maybe I just want to allow OneDrive through our system. If OneDrive doesn't update and they're now running on a different port, or they have a different signature, or they release something new, then anything I had a policy set specifically to OneDrive may break. And this will allow you to review those policies to make sure you're not breaking anything existing. Right. There again, in a next generation firewall like this, it's actually monitoring the traffic that's going through that. It is not port 80 or 443 or whatever else. It knows exactly what kind of traffic is passing through there. And 9 times out of 10, it can figure it out pretty on the nose, right? There is thousands and thousands of applications it's identified based on signature and the traffic flowing through it. Anybody got any questions on the dynamic update side? Okay. Again, in the lab, we'll actually take you through doing these updates. I think it just has you refresh and check to see a new one. You can update to your heart's content and see if something blows up, right? That's the whole point of the lab environment. You're never actually going to break anything. All right, so the first module is pretty simple. All we're doing is unboxing it, essentially, and logging in, setting up the basic configuration so that we can start to manage the firewall from there on out, all right? And then from there, making sure that we have the location of the firewall licenses, everything's configured on the management side, and then how we go about updating the Palo Alto software, including the apps and the what? There's 3 things we can update, minimum. What are the 3 we talked about that we could update? The operating system itself. There was 2 more.
Applications.
The applications and threats. And then what was the other one? I think
Wildfire.
I mentioned
it. Antivirus.
Antivirus, right? Wildfire is another one. It wasn't listed here, but it is another one that would get updated too. All right. So now it's the pop quiz time. Let's see what everybody can do. All right. So what 2 attributes of the dedicated out-of-band network management port in the Palo Alto firewall? Is it A, labeled MGT by default, or B, cannot be configured as a standard traffic port, supports only SSH connections as C, and D, requires a static non-DHCP configuration? And this is going to be very hard for you guys to remember, so let's just change that. Stand by. Let's do that. Share. There. Okay. That's probably easier. So on number 1, there should be 2 of those that's correct. Anybody have an idea for one of them?
A and C.
A and C. So C says that we can only support SSH connections.
Oh, no. No, then.
Definitely wouldn't be that one, right? Because we just showed the whole web
The
UI
A and B then.
90% of it.
A and B.
Okay. Anybody got an argument with that one? The only one left is D, right? Which says it requires a static non-DHCP network configuration, which we know is not true, right? We can set it as static and we can set it as DHCP. By default, which one's static? Right, it's a 192 address, but which firewall is static by default? The non-VMs, the hardware, the physical hardware. Yep. It's a reverse question of the one earlier, right? I asked which ones can be DHCP. Okay, you are correct. It is A and B. True or false? You will need the firewall serial number in order to register the hardware firewall. True. Where do you get the firewall serial number? Is anybody reading the slide? Because I didn't say it, but it was on the slide. From the dashboard. Yep. Perfect. In the web interface, what is signified when a text box is highlighted in red? Yep. B, that it's required. Perfect. And last, true or false, service routes can be used to configure an in-band port to access external services. True, right? The idea behind service routes is that we can then configure another port. And in-band means that it is something that we are configuring for outside access. We can configure that to do all the external services. Otherwise, if we don't have in-band, we have out-of-band, right? And out-of-band is our management port, which is what it uses by default. Okay. So on a lab step, we'll talk about more of this on Thursday. Not too worried about that. And your answers are all true. Good work. All right. That in a gist is what a module will look like on Tuesdays. Again, these are going to get longer, right? This pretty simple intro stuff. When we get into security policies, you wish it would be this small. All right. Let's see here. I'm going to pause that side. Great. And